What's going on, guys? Ethan James here. We are watching this video, The Real Reason So Many Are Deconstructing Their Faith, Wes Huff. I think this is a really interesting topic. For the past 5 to 7 years, there's been this movement called the Deconstructionist movement. It's a lot of people that are claiming to be Christians that are deconstructing their faith. And it's because they've been taught things that were wrong or that they don't believe what they've been told anymore. It's just really interesting. And I'm curious to see what Wes Huff has to say about it. Obviously, Wes Huff blew up recently, went on Joe Rogan. There was that whole debate with, I forget his name already. Billy Carson, that's his name. He did that debate with Billy Carson, but he'd had a channel going on for a while now, and it's just a really smart dude, expert in textual criticism. So I'm really interested to hear what he has to say about this.
I think if we're talking about what I think are probably the legitimate issues with a lot of people who go through the quote-unquote deconstruction, I'm not sure that they were given the proper nutrients and foundation and soil quality to be able to grow roots that actually gave them subsistence, so that when those things did happen, it was somewhat too late already. And so I think, what I would want to encourage people is that the point of deconstruction is reconstruction, because if you deconstruct something and you don't reconstruct it, it's just demolition, right? And so your worldview perspective shouldn't be a movement of demolition.
So this is a really interesting point, and I've been reading Francis Schaeffer a while back, and Francis Schaeffer was this big theological guy. He very prominent at his time, and he was around about the 70s. He wrote a series of books that were very popular, one of which was True Spirituality, where he actually goes through this period of deconstruction because he was being disenfranchised basically about a lot of the people and the things that he was seeing in the church. And so he just went through this process of deconstructing his faith, and he ended up reconstructing it actually as a stronger theological doctrine, I suppose. His personal theology, he just reconstructed it in a very strong way, and it's called True Spirituality, and that's exactly what he did. Not just throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Even though people that do that, that's their faith is so shaken that it can just be torn apart and never reconstructed. To me, that's were they ever really Christian? Did they ever really have faith?
Doubt is not a problem, but it's not the destination. So if we see doubt as the destination and we get fixated with that, we're not actually getting to the answers that we should be pursuing in a lot of those things. And unfortunately, I think that's what I see a lot, is that people are kind of taking doubt and they're putting it in the place of the final place where the answer should come from. And they're pushing into their questions, but without actually trying to seek answers. And in that sense, a lot of people become cynics rather than skeptics. Because I'm, to some degree, I'm a skeptic. I will reserve judgment on a particular topic until I feel like I have sufficient answers for any said topic. But a cynic, I think, is doing so because the questions are the endpoint for them. And I think that's where we should be honest and self-reflective and say, maybe there are actually answers that provide sufficient groundwork to actually reconstruct the deconstruction that we've been putting ourselves through. I think.
So, and just to follow up on that, if anybody is watching this and they happen to feel like deconstructing their faith, that usually whenever I'm reading the Bible and if there's something that I come across that I just don't quite understand, I don't automatically assume that the text is wrong or flawed or that there isn't a good answer to the question that I have. Usually, if we're honest and humble, that it's that we don't understand the answer. And first step to do is ask God to give you the wisdom and understanding to be able to discern what the answer is. And then to do our due diligence in finding it, and just trust that God will give us the answer and give us peace about that answer. I think a sense of humility when approaching this text that has been the most heavily criticized text in all of history is warranted.
We're in a unique point in time where people are open to certain things, and maybe they're in some regards disenfranchised with a superficial religiosity that they may have experienced. If they did grow up in the church, say, in my instance, in the early 2000s, there was a lot of just kind of superficiality, seeker sensitivity that I think had the right motivation, but the wrong method by which to go about that. In that they genuinely saw that they wanted to get people through the doors of the church, which is a good goal to have. But in doing so, what they were trying to win them with is what they won them to. And so because it was very superficial, it was very kind of on the surface, it didn't have any substantial depth. When the winds and the rains of trial and suffering, hurt, did eventually come, there was no root system to be able to ground them. You talked about, that having that foundation before. When my parents lived in Ontario, we moved our family across to British Columbia for a couple of years. And when we did move, my dad, my grandfather, and I drove our van and a U-Haul trailer across the country. And I remember very vividly in Saskatchewan driving across like the very flat fields, right? Watching a dog run away for a week. And seeing this giant tree in the middle of the field that just kind of stood out. And it was always this picture of, for me, how did that tree survive? And the answer was, it had a root system that probably was both grounding it and pulling in the nutrients that were required for its particular growth in that point in time.
It certainly did. And as a tree expert, that's exactly what happens, is that the tap roots go so deep. And sometimes what happens is periods of drought are good for the tree because then it allows its roots to grow deeper. But the reason why he's using this analogy is hopefully for people that already know, there's the parable of the farmer and the sower, and the farmer is tossing out seeds everywhere, and some seed lands on good soil and some seeds land on bad soil. And so part of my personal testimony is I didn't want to be one of the seeds that fell on ground and it took root, but then it was pushed out by the thorns, the pressures of the world and society. And so, I prayed against that because that is exactly what I was susceptible of, is being pushed around by any whim of strong doctrine by anybody. So, I prayed to God that I would not be that. And what the result of that was deep research and knowing the word and being confident in what I do believe. And so now I have deeper roots and growing ever deeper.
But it's too late for the tree to try to grow the roots in the midst of the storm.
Is there one manuscript, ancient manuscript, that you've held that has completely impacted you, changed your heart, your faith? And how old was it, and which one was it?
I don't think there's one that's necessarily kind of affected me strongly. Every time I get the opportunity to be able to hold in my hand or view something that goes, say, back to the 2nd or 3rd century, what it does for me is it encapsulates the fact that I can, to some degree, standing in front of, say, a 2nd century fragment of the Gospel of John, which I've done. What I feel in that moment is, who was the person 2,000 years ago, almost 2,000 years, who was likewise standing in front of this piece of written material and putting the ink on the page. It's this kind of looking down the timeline of history and including myself in it to some degree within the family tree of, there's no way to know whether the scribe was a Christian or not, but even hypothetically just kind of putting the idea in that maybe this was a late 2nd century Christian. And it would have been very costly for them to inscribe, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, onto a piece of material in a time frame when they could have been in a region that was illegal to do so. And so being in the family tree of historical Christianity and finding myself on a branch almost 2,000 years later, tying myself tangibly to that point in time, to that person, I think does something to the nature of the faith that I believe, in that I'm not an island. I'm part of a broader story that God has invited me into and invited so many other people, going back to, calling the patriarchs, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God is a personal God and invites us all into that narrative and story. So it's this unique perspective of looking at an artifact and the artifact tying my own personal faith journey into.
Have you held any manuscripts that are, whether it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, any pieces of those manuscripts written by somebody who directly witnessed the life of Christ that you're like, this is John. John wrote this. I'm holding it.
No. And the fact is, we don't have any documents, written kind of artifacts of papyrus or parchment that would go back that early. The earliest documents that we have of the Bible go back to the 2nd century. But I think what we can say about that is that what we're dealing with, though it be a copy, is a copy that reflects what the original was written about. And this is also testified to by some of the early Christian writers who themselves were disciples of the disciples. Mm-hmm. So you have this category of people who we call the apostolic fathers, and they're called that particularly because they had a direct tie to Peter, to John, to Paul, and can comment on something like, we know who Mark is. He's the traveling companion of Peter. He wrote down that which Peter told him. We have these kind of testimonies. And so if we're going to call it like the dating of how we know that those documents are 1st century, coming in the eyewitness period, it's less to do with the tangible manuscript evidence that we have in saying, this was written by John, because I'm not even sure how you would identify that, even if we did find a 1st century manuscript.
I think it's my wishful thinking.
Yeah.
So what I really love about Wes Huff is how knowledgeable he is on his craft, and even though something that might kind of like shake something like, oh, we don't have John didn't write the things that we have now. It's like, how can we be sure? This is his field of study, and just like his answer, that these were things that were copies of what everybody was taught basically in 3rd century. For context, in 325, that's when they canonized a lot of scripture, if I'm not mistaken, right at the Council of Nicaea. And the fact that these were letters that were circulated all around the churches that they had and that they looked to, and that there was all the different churches were all in agreement on. So it's not a game of telephone as much as it is a telling people. It's multiple sources coming out and then all agreeing with each other. So it's not like a game of telephone.
And I think, in a modern sense, we have the capability to tie things back to, but that's true for everything from the ancient world. We have no document that we can call the original autograph of, whether that's Caesar or whether that's Marcus Aurelius, Plutarch, Xenophon, Tacitus, any of these ancient writers. We're all dealing with copies of copies of copies. And that doesn't dilute our ability to know that that is what the original authors wrote, but it's this fascinating network of the fact that the early Christians were very tenacious to get the gospel message out. And so the fact that we find copies in Egypt, but then also later on in places like Britain and across Asia and all over Europe and North Africa is a testament to the Christians were very eager to get the message of who Jesus was. And that meant that it was spread very far and very fast, very early on, which precluded any one person or group of people controlling the text at any one point in time. So though we don't have a copy that we can say, actually this is Matthew's copy and he wrote this with his own hand, the fact that we have copies of Matthew that are so widely spread throughout the ancient world, and we can compare them, and even if differences pop up in Asia, we know that those differences are geographically located because we don't find them in Europe or in North Africa. And so if someone wanted to, in a kind of Da Vinci Code-esque way, write in a particular doctrine to the Bible, they would have had to have the means of control to find all the copies in all the other places all across the ancient world and alter them And that would have been just impossible because there are copies buried in the sands of Egypt. They would have had no idea.
And that's interesting because these stories line up amongst all these copies, these oral traditions that are passed on and written down. The stories about Jesus line up. So you're right. In fact, the more copies there are, the more evidence there is that the stories about him are true and valid.
Oh, and it goes right into the next video, which is music I was listening to. So that's the video, and he re-emphasized what I was just saying there about how there's so many different copies that if somebody wanted to try and control the narrative, it would be the outlier, right? And so people talk about how Constantine or the Roman Church should like be able to manipulate this stuff, and Constantine had no forbearance over what all the early church fathers, how they were assembling these texts and how they were agreeing upon them, And then also, I hear there's a lot of evidence to suggest that Constantine's conversion was true, but it was obviously very early in the church story where they weren't getting a lot of things right in the first rendition of Christendom. But God is working all things out in time. So, yeah, that's the video. Thank you very much for watching. Hopefully you liked the commentary. If you did, drop a like, subscribe. That would really help me out. I'm just going to keep doing this and until, we hit a stride. So, yeah. Thank you again for watching. May you bless the Lord, and may he keep you. Where'd my mouse go? Oh. It's gone. My mouse is gone. I'm trying to edit this out. Oh, no. It's not showing up on my other screen. I think my mouse is dying is why. I'm probably going to have to edit this out. What happens? Oh, there we go.